Sylvie Ashcombe had learned to live quietly. In her small cottage on the edge of Fawley Heath, life passed like the soft ticking of an old clock, slow, predictable, and safe. People in the village had long stopped asking why Sylvie never married or why she never had children. Over time, her life became part of the village furniture, unnoticed and unbothered. But that morning, the world shifted. She found him curled up on her porch bench, as if he had always belonged there. A boy, maybe 15 or 16, with a threadbare hoodie pulled over his head and mud-caked shoes dangling off the side. His face was buried into his knees, but Sylvie could see enough. His hands were bruised, his clothes torn at the seams, and his body shivered in the soft dawn light. She stood in the doorway for a moment, heart pounding. The village was safe. Nothing ever happened here. Strangers didn't just appear. Boy. Her voice cracked. Are you all right? He flinched, then slowly lifted his head. His eyes, grey, stormy, far too tired for someone so young, met hers. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Then came the words that would turn Sylvie's world upside down. I'm Elias, he said, voice hoarse. I'm your grandson. Sylvie's breath left her in a rush. It wasn't anger that surged through her. It was confusion, thick and suffocating. I think you've made a mistake, she replied, as firmly as she could manage. I never had children. Elias didn't argue. He didn't beg. He just sat there, his hands gripping the edge of the bench, as if holding himself together. I know you didn't, he said softly, but you're still my family. Sylvie should have called someone, anyone. But there was something in his voice, something so familiar it made her legs weak. Against her better judgment, she unlocked the door and gestured for him to come inside. I don't keep much food, she mumbled as she filled the kettle. Didn't expect company this morning. Elias smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile boys his age should wear. It was tired, guarded, and far too old. Over tea and a stale biscuit, Sylvie tried to make sense of him. He said very little. Every answer was short, every glance careful. Yet, in those silences, he revealed more than he intended. He knew about the lavender soaps she kept in the bathroom cupboard. He knew her late mother's cat figurine collection stood in the living room's glass cabinet. He even mentioned a photograph, one Sylvie kept hidden in a drawer, the only picture of her and her twin sister, Marla, when they were 17. That photograph had never been on display. The air grew heavier with every passing moment. Sylvie's fingers trembled around her teacup. She hadn't spoken Marla's name aloud in years. Who sent you here? She asked, more sharply than she meant to. Elias looked down at his hands. No one. My grandma passed away. She told me if anything ever happened to her, I should find you. She said you were all I had left. It felt like someone had knocked the breath from her lungs. Marla, the sister who had vanished from their lives, swept away in a scandal that the village never let Sylvie forget. For years, Marla's name had been a ghost, haunting Sylvie's quiet existence. But Marla was gone now. And in her place stood this boy who carried the same defiant tilt of Marla's chin, the same storm-grey eyes. I don't understand, Sylvie whispered. Marla, she never had children. Elias looked up then, his voice low but steady. Maybe you didn't know everything about her. There was no accusation in his tone. Only sadness. It was that sadness that made Sylvie's heart crack open. As the sun rose higher, Sylvie realized the boy on her porch wasn't a mistake. He was a question. A question she didn't have answers to, but she wanted to find them. All right then, Elias, she said, pushing herself up from the chair. You can stay tonight. But we'll sort this out in the morning. Elias didn't smile. But the way his shoulders loosened, the way his breath steadied, it was gratitude, loud and clear. That evening, as the village lights flickered on, Sylvie sat by her window, watching the boy who claimed to be hers sleep on the couch. She had locked her heart for so long, convinced that nothing unexpected could happen to her anymore. But sometimes, life knocks on your door when you least expect it. And sometimes, it sleeps on your porch. By morning, the village had found out. Sylvie Ashcombe had always known that Fawley Heath had ears, Walls whispered, windows listened. But this was different. She hadn't left her gate before Mrs. Tewkesbury from across the lane was already standing at her fence, arms folded, eyes glinting. "I heard you had a visitor," Mrs. Tewkesbury said, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "Stray, was he? Poor thing. They always find their way to kind-hearted souls, don't they?" Sylvie didn't answer. Not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know what to say. How could she explain Elias? How could she explain that her quiet life had been split open by a boy who claimed to be family when she had none? Elias stayed inside, away from prying eyes. He didn't complain. He sat by the window, fingers tracing the edges of a locket he refused to open. As the day passed, more faces peered through Sylvie's gate. The butcher's wife, the vicar's sister, even old Mr. Harrow with his walking cane. They didn't ask outright, but their stares were questions, and their smiles were knives. By evening, Sylvie's patience had thinned to a fragile thread. She needed answers. Not village gossip, not curious looks, answers. She found them in the most unexpected place. Mrs. Alden, once Marla's closest friend, lived 3 streets down. A woman who had grown brittle with age but whose memory remained sharp as flint. Sylvie hadn't spoken to her in years, not since the night Marla had vanished. "I was wondering how long it'd take you," Mrs. Alden said as Sylvie stood on her doorstep, awkward and breathless. "Come in, Sylvie. We've got years to dust off." Inside, over a pot of tea far better than her own, Sylvie asked the question that had been burning in her chest. Did Marla have a child? The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, crowded with things unsaid. Mrs. Alden sighed, leaning back in her chair. Marla was reckless, but she wasn't heartless. She left to protect that boy. Your father wouldn't have accepted him. He barely accepted her. Sylvie's fingers curled tightly around her teacup. She remembered her father's iron rules, the coldness that had driven Marla away. "She wrote to you, you know," Mrs. Alden continued gently. "Letters. Every birthday, every Christmas. I don't think you ever got them." Sylvie's heart squeezed. "No, I didn't." "That's because your father never let you." The words hit harder than Sylvie expected. Her father had died with his secrets. But this one, this cruel theft of connection, felt like a fresh betrayal. She had a boy. Sylvie's voice trembled. "Elias' father." Mrs. Alden nodded. "A beautiful boy. Named him Jonah. But life wasn't kind to them, Sylvie. Marla raised him away from here, but she never stopped hoping to mend things with you." Sylvie's throat tightened. "And Elias? Jonah's boy. Looks like Marla, doesn't he?" Sylvie swallowed hard. "He's here, on my porch, saying I'm his only family left." Mrs. Alden smiled softly, sadness swimming in her eyes. "Then maybe life's giving you another chance." The walk back to her cottage felt longer. The village felt smaller, as though its eyes pressed down heavier. But Sylvie's heart was louder now, louder than their whispers. When she stepped through the door, Elias was sitting at the table, the unopened locket still in his hand. "I found out," Sylvie said gently. Elias looked up, his expression unreadable. "You're Marla's grandson. Jonah's boy." Elias nodded slowly. "I didn't know how to say it. People, they don't like hearing things that don't fit into their stories." Sylvie sat across from him, reaching out. "Well, I've had enough of their stories. Let's make our own." For the first time since he'd arrived, Elias smiled. Not the tired, guarded smile, but something softer, warmer. And in that moment, Sylvie realized that the boy wasn't just seeking shelter. He was seeking a place to belong. And perhaps, so was she. But outside, the whispers grew louder. The village wasn't finished with them yet. And Sylvie knew, the hardest part was still ahead. By the 3rd day, the village had sharpened its knives. Sylvie noticed it in the way people crossed the street when she walked by. The way conversations dropped to whispers when she entered the bakery. Fawley Heath had always loved its silence, its routine. And Sylvie had broken that without even meaning to. But it wasn't until the letter arrived that Sylvie realized how deep the wound had cut. No name. No return address. Just a plain envelope shoved through her letterbox. Inside, a single sheet of paper, written in neat, spiteful letters. We thought you had more sense than to bring back the shame your family left behind. Sylvie's hands trembled as she folded the paper back. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She just stood there, the weight of a lifetime of small-town judgment pressing down harder than it ever had. Elias found her by the sink, staring out the window. "They don't want me here, do they?" he asked quietly. Sylvie's heart clenched. "They don't know you. They don't want to." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The house felt too small for all the unsaid words. "I can leave," Elias whispered, not looking at her. "I've had worse places." Sylvie turned sharply. "You're not going anywhere." He blinked, startled. "I let this village scare me into silence once," Sylvie continued, her voice rising. "I let them chase Marla away. I won't do it again. Not to you." But words were easier spoken than lived. The village's coldness seeped into everything, until even Sylvie's house, once her safe place, began to feel like a cage. And then, the unthinkable happened. Mrs. Alden arrived at her door, breathless and pale. "Sylvie, you need to come with me." "What's happened?" "They've gone too far. Come." Mrs. Alden led her to the community notice board at the heart of the village square. Tucked right in the center was a flyer, a grainy photo of Elias sitting on Sylvie's porch, his face half-turned from the camera. Above it, in bold letters, "Runaway boy found at Ashcombe Cottage. Is this safe?" Sylvie's vision blurred with fury. The village hadn't just whispered now. They had shouted. Publicly. Cruelly. By the time she returned home, Elias had seen it too. He didn't say anything. He simply sat on the steps, his shoulders hunched, the locket dangling from his fingers. "I knew it was a mistake coming here," he said quietly. Sylvie knelt beside him, her heart aching. "No, Elias. The mistake was mine. I should have fought for Marla. I should have fought for you from the moment you stepped on my porch." Elias finally opened the locket. Inside, there was a faded photo of Marla, young, wild-eyed, with a boy on her lap. "She used to tell me stories about you," Elias murmured. "Said you were the quiet one, but you had the kindest heart." Sylvie's throat tightened. "I don't deserve that kindness. I let too much slip away." "But you opened the door for me," Elias said, looking at her. "Maybe that's enough." In that fragile moment, Sylvie made a choice. The village could watch. They could whisper and sneer. But they would not decide the story this time. The very next day, Sylvie did what no one expected. She walked hand in hand with Elias into the village square. Straight past the stairs. Past the whispers. To the very notice board where his photo had been pinned. She took out a pen, drew a thick line through the hateful words, and wrote beneath. "His name is Elias. He belongs with me." For a heartbeat, the square was silent. And then, from the edge of the crowd, a voice, soft but firm. "I knew Marla. She was a good woman." Mrs. Alden. Then another. "I don't fancy living in a village that bullies a boy." Old Mr. Harrow, cane tapping against the cobblestone. The silence cracked. Not everyone spoke up, but enough did. Enough to make Sylvie realize that sometimes people just need someone to be brave first. That night, back at the cottage, Elias asked her, "Did you really mean it? That I belong with you?" Sylvie smiled, pulling him into a quiet hug. "You were always meant to, Elias. We just took a long road finding each other." But the journey wasn't over yet. Because there was one more place they had to go. Marla's grave. The next morning was quiet. But it wasn't the heavy, suffocating quiet that had haunted Sylvie for years. This quiet felt different, like a held breath, like a moment waiting to unfold. Elias stood by the window, his coat too big, his hands tucked in the pockets. "Are we really doing this?" he asked, glancing back at Sylvie. She nodded. "We are." The path to the cemetery wasn't long, but it felt sacred. Neither of them spoke much on the way. Words felt unnecessary. Fawley Heath still watched them, but their stares had softened. The notice on the board had been taken down. Someone, maybe Mrs. Alden, had replaced it with a small sign that read, "Kindness begins with courage." When they reached Marla's grave, Sylvie's heart thudded louder. The headstone was simple, tucked beneath an old oak tree, its edges softened by time. Marla Ashcombe, beloved daughter. A wild heart. Sylvie knelt beside it, brushing away the fallen leaves. She hadn't visited in years. Not because she didn't care, but because guilt had been her anchor. But today, that anchor felt lighter. Elias crouched beside her, placing the locket gently on the stone. "I wish I'd known her more," he said softly. "But I know she was brave." "She was," Sylvie whispered, her voice trembling. "And foolish. And wonderful." For a long moment, they sat in silence, bound by memories, some shared, some only imagined. Then Elias did something unexpected. He took Sylvie's hand and placed a small, folded letter in her palm. "She wrote this," he said. "Never sent it. I found it in her things after she passed. I thought you should read it." Sylvie unfolded the letter, her hands shaking. Marla's handwriting danced across the page, messy and alive. "Sylvie, if you're reading this, it means I never found the courage to face you again. I hope you can forgive me. I hope you know I never stopped loving you. If life is cruel and you end up reading this too late, I pray my boy finds his way to you. You were always the kindest of us." Tears blurred the words, but Sylvie smiled through them. For the first time in years, the ache in her chest softened. "I think she knew this moment would come," Elias said quietly. Sylvie nodded. She always did love her dramatic endings. They laughed, softly, as though Marla herself might be listening. But just as they were about to leave, a voice called out, "Sylvie." She turned. Standing at the edge of the cemetery was a woman she barely recognized, Laura Tewkesbury, daughter of the ever-watchful Mrs. Tewkesbury. Unlike her mother, Laura's eyes weren't sharp. They were soft, hesitant. "I heard about the boy," Laura said, approaching carefully. I know what it's like to be pushed out of a place you suppose to call home. My husband and I, we live out by the old mill now. It's not much, but it's quiet. Peaceful." Sylvie frowned, not understanding. "I thought," Laura continued nervously, "if you and Elias ever wanted a fresh start, somewhere the past doesn't cling so hard, you'd be welcome there." Sylvie's breath caught. She hadn't expected that. Not from this village. Not from the Tewkesbury line. Elias looked up at her, his eyes wide, hopeful. It wasn't a grand twist. It wasn't a movie-perfect redemption. But it was an opening. A small, unexpected gift wrapped in kindness. As they walked back to the cottage, hand in hand, Sylvie realized that life's most beautiful twists weren't always loud or sweeping. Sometimes, they were quiet. A knock on the door. A letter long kept. A stranger who isn't a stranger after all. Elias belonged with her. Not because of blood or obligation, but because they had chosen each other. And sometimes, that was all that mattered. The heart often finds family in the most unexpected places. It's not where we come from, but the choices we make to stand by each other that truly define belonging. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that inspire, challenge, and stay with you.